Hello, my name is Michael Rushton, and I'm here at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I teach and direct the arts administration programs here at the O'Neill School, and I'm also a co-director of our recently founded Center for Cultural Affairs. And what I'm going to talk about today is a paper that I wrote a few years ago, actually, on local arts funding. And it is, here you can see, support for earmarked public spending on culture, evidence from a referendum in metropolitan Detroit, and this was published in Public Budgeting and Finance in the year 2005. Makes it kind of an older paper now, 15 years old, but to my knowledge, this is the only in-depth study of voting patterns on the arts in the United States since that time. So it's still relevant and still gets cited now and again. There's more European studies, since Europeans often have referenda on the arts, but this is the only American one I know of. So what's going on here? Well, in the United States, most funding for the arts happens at the local level. We do have a National Endowment for the Arts to talk about funding of the arts at the federal level, and of course all the states have their arts councils. But the US, because it is so big, because it is so diverse across many axes, it turns out that it actually makes a lot of sense to do most of the funding of arts organizations and artists at the local level. Right, so that's great. How can cities and counties and metropolitan areas go about that? Well, there's two ways to do this. One is that you can have a local arts council that every year or every 2 years goes through the budgetary process, makes requests from the treasurer's office for a particular budget. They get a budget allocation, and then they go ahead and do their business giving grants to arts organizations and artists. Another way to do it, a different way, is to have what's called an earmarked tax. Now what an earmarked tax is when there's an agreement to take a part of a particular tax and guarantee that that goes to the arts. And so it takes it out of the ordinary budget request process, and you just have this steady stream where the Arts Council knows this is where this money is going to come from. And that's an earmarked tax. Now, a lot of cities have adopted this. It gives more stable funding so that arts organizations can know that, well, we're not in danger of funding being totally cut because we have this guaranteed revenue source. Often it also ends up leading to more funding, because if people vote directly on something, often you can actually get more money for the arts than if it just goes through the budgetary process. So a lot of cities have done this. In Denver and in Salt Lake City, they take a portion of the sales tax, the retail sales tax, that gets dedicated to the arts. In cities like San Francisco or Columbus, Ohio, they take a part of the hotels tax and devote that to the arts. In St. Louis, they dedicate part of the property tax to arts and big organizations, the St. Louis Art Museum, the zoo, the Botanical Gardens. And in Cleveland, they use a portion of cigarette taxes to fund the arts. That tends to be fairly lucrative. So these taxes usually have to be approved by referendum. So you have to essentially get voters to agree to this. And what happened here in Detroit in 2002 was that they had a proposal for an increase in the property tax that would go to the arts. Now, one thing about these kinds of votes and this way of doing it is it can be different in every city. So, as I've just said, different cities use different tax bases, like sales taxes or property taxes or hotel taxes. And also you have to think about questions like, well, what arts organizations are actually going to be funded? Is it all going to go to really big organizations? Is most of the money going back to small community-based organizations? You also have to ask questions about what geographical region is going to be covered. A lot of things have to be figured out. And so each one of these earmark taxes in the United States is slightly different in its own way. So the Detroit one was going to work like this. It was going to be 2 counties, Wayne County, which includes the city of Detroit, and Oakland County, which is to its northwest. So let me pop up a map here. Oops. Sorry, let's go back. There. So here we have a map of Greater Detroit. So here's Wayne County and the city of Detroit. This is Canada, of course. And here is Oakland County to the northwest, and the biggest city in Oakland County is Pontiac. And so the referendum on whether to increase property taxes to fund the arts was going to cover Wayne and Oakland County. Now, it did not cover Macomb County, which was kind of an issue because lots of people live there, and you notice that some of the people in Macomb County would actually be quite close to the big arts organizations that are in downtown Detroit. They were actually going to get a good deal because if this were approved, they would get to enjoy all the benefits of that arts tax without having to pay it. That actually became a bit of an issue in the campaign. The vote failed. It did not pass due to various county regulations and so on. Just going to study that. In Wayne County, it had to get 60% of the vote, and in Oakland County, it had to get 50% of the vote, and it came up just a little bit short in both counties. So, why? Why did it fail? Why didn't this pass? Well, there were a few issues that, if you look back to sort of the newspaper stories from this, you get a few ideas. One complaint was that a lot of the money was going to go to fairly big arts organizations. So 2/3 of all the money from this was going to go to just 21 major museums and arts organizations, some of which are quite wealthy, like say the Ford Museum or something like that. And only 1/3 was going to go back to community organizations. And some people were saying, well, why are we raising this money on our property taxes just to fund some organizations that are going to be fairly rich? The median house price at the time in these 2 counties was $130,000, right? Detroit's not a very expensive place to live, as I think most people know, but that would have been a tax increase just even on that median house of about $32 a year. That's quite a bit of money. And so, you know, you did have that problem of people saying, I own a pretty ordinary priced house here, my property taxes are going to go up $32 a year to pay for some organizations that probably have more money than I do. So it was not clear to some people how they were actually going to benefit from this. So what did I do in my study? Well, what I did in my study is I wanted to find out, well, who voted for this? Like, who voted yes and who voted no? And can we break that down? So here's what I did. I took all of the different voting precincts in these 2 counties, all right? Now you think of a voting precinct, think about, say, the elementary school where you go to cast your ballot. Consider that a precinct, just for that very small neighborhood, all right? Second thing I did was I got all the numbers on how people voted in those precincts, and I matched them up to census tracts, because census tracts are where we can get data on the characteristics of the neighborhood. What are incomes like? What is the racial and ethnic diversity? And all of these kinds of questions. And so I matched the precincts, about 2,000 precincts, to the census tracts, and there were about 1,000 census tracts. This was actually fairly painstaking because the boundaries don't always match up just so. And then I did a regression. And I did a regression on the percentage of a census tract voting yes on the initiative to increase taxes for the arts, and ran that against what are all the characteristics of that tract. All right? So that was how I went about this. So let's have a look at how people voted. And here's my map. So again, you can see we've got Wayne County and Oakland County. The darker green is where a high proportion of voters voted yes. So the darkest green is essentially over 3/4 of people voting yes on this. The medium green is sort of between 40 and 60%, so that's kind of the median areas. And the light green is where there was very little support. Well, what's the first thing you see when you just look at the map? Well, the first thing you see when you look at the map is it looks like people in the city of Detroit were far more in favor of this than as you go out further and further. That's actually not very surprising, because when you measure this, if you take, I can't reach it with my hand, but if you take the far northwest corner of Oakland County, you're 58 miles from the central district of Detroit, where all of your big arts organizations are. That's a long way, right? So you were asking people to increase their taxes for arts organizations that were mostly quite a fair distance away from that. It's also probably a bit of self-selection going on, and the people who have chosen to live in a really distant suburb are thinking, yeah, the opera is not really my thing. If I were really interested in going to classical music concerts all the time, I'd probably live closer into the city, okay? So we can see just on the map that distance plays a part, and that makes sense. And it does give a lesson for anybody who is thinking about setting up an earmark tax for their city. What's the appropriate geographic area here? Should I be including exurban areas that maybe don't feel like they're going to get much benefit from this? Maybe it should be a little bit more localized. Okay, but distance isn't the only thing. What are the other variables that turned out to matter or not matter? Some of them surprised me. So the average age of people turned out not to matter. One of the things we know about the sort of so-called high arts is that it's mostly older people who go. But it turned out that the average age in the census tract didn't really mean much. Another surprising one was that income and house value didn't mean much. That's kind of interesting, because you think, well, wouldn't it be more richer people that would tend to go? It turned out no, I didn't really find much correlation at all between income levels and house values and proportion voting yes. So who did vote yes? What things did matter besides distance? Well, here's a list of a few things that turned out to be significant. What's the proportion of people who are renters rather than homeowners? Okay, well, think about it. If you're a renter, you're thinking, well, is the property tax my problem, right? Is this actually going to be reflected in my rent? Maybe not. So a renter might think, well, this is a good deal. Property owners are going to pay this tax. I'm not, and I can get the benefits from it. So renters, neighborhoods with a lot of renters tended to vote more in favor of this tax. The percentage of adults with at least a bachelor's degree turned out to be fairly important. So any census tract that had a lot of people with at least a bachelor's degree, that census tract tended to vote yes as well. That we did kind of expect, because one of the things we find on opinion surveys of the arts all the time is that more so than income, levels of formal education actually mean a lot in terms of people's attendance at the arts and general support for public funding of the arts. So education did tend to matter. People without a vehicle, if the census tract had more people without vehicles, they tended to vote more for this. African Americans, if the census tract had a higher proportion of African Americans, it was also more likely to vote for this. Well, there's a number of factors that seem to influence which neighborhoods, which census tracts voted yes. What was the biggest effect? Well, when I ran the regressions, and if you're interested, you can see them in detail in the paper, the thing that actually mattered the most was, at this election, which was a November vote, there was also a vote for the governor of the state of Michigan. And people who voted Democrat for governor overwhelmingly tended to vote yes on this tax. People who voted Republican for governor strongly voted no. So there did seem to be a bit of political polarization on this as well. And we do see this fairly consistently in American politics across the country, not just in Detroit. But people who lean Democrat tend to also lean towards, yes, public funding of the arts is a good idea. People who lean Republican tend to think, no, public funding of the arts is not such a good idea. It's not hard and fast. You do get people who lean Republican who think funding of the arts is a good idea. You get people who lean Democrat who think it's a bad idea. But in general, you do tend to get that result, and that's what we found here. What do we learn from this case? I think in terms of designing an earmark tax for the arts, one of the things you really want to think of is, how do you make the case to people that this is a good thing for the general population? You have to get a broad base of people in favor of this, and so you've got to think, how do we have a wide appeal? If you look at cities that have successfully passed referenda on this, you see that they fund a wide range of activities, including a lot of community arts organizations. They'll often include things like the zoo or the botanical gardens to try to get as wide a variety of people who can see that, yes, I would at least benefit from some of the things that this funds, even if not everything. I don't tend to go to the ballet, but I do tend to go to the zoo, or vice versa. You also have to have people thinking it is fair and equitable, because if people think this is a tax that is just going to fund the rich, if people think that some people are going to get a free ride while they are shouldering the bill, they're going to tend to oppose that, because one thing we know when it comes to taxes is that fairness plays a very large part on this. One coda to this whole thing, and this happened after I'd published the paper, but in 2012, the three-county area, Oakland County, Wayne County, and Macomb County was included in this, agreed to a property tax increase for one institution only, and that's the Detroit Museum of Art. It has been a sort of a troubled institution. It went very near bankruptcy, and so this was a property tax increase that was smaller and directly focused on one single institution. And part of the deal was, if it got this funding, it would offer free admission to everybody. That's very much like what they do in St. Louis. So in St. Louis, they have a property tax that is dedicated to the art museum, but the art museum maintains a policy of free admission so that everybody can benefit from it. So Detroit ended up going that way, but it did not pass this particular earmarked tax. So things to think about for other cities that propose these, but it's certainly an interesting case study, and I'd be really interested to see if future researchers also dig down into precinct level data and find out who supports the arts and who doesn't. So thanks very much.